Today, we're going to dig into a pretty sobering United Nations report. It's all about the human rights crisis in Myanmar, a crisis that, for a lot of the world, is basically happening in the shadows. And that's really the key thing the UN is trying to get across right from the start. Our headlines are packed with other global events, but all the while, this devastating situation in Myanmar just keeps getting worse, way outside the international spotlight. Let's put some numbers on this because they're just staggering. Since the military coup back in 2021, 3.6 million people have been forced to flee their homes. Think about that. Millions of lives just completely turned upside down, all searching for a safe place that's getting harder and harder to find. And the military's campaign isn't just about forcing people out. The report details more than 100,000 civilian homes being deliberately burned to the ground. And make no mistake, this isn't some accident of war. It's a calculated, systematic strategy of terror. And all of this leads to a number that's, honestly, it's hard to wrap your head around. Nearly 22 million people. That's almost half the entire population of the country now need humanitarian help just to get by. The scale is just immense. So the big question is, how is the military junta holding on to power with all this chaos? Well, the UN report really breaks it down to three key things, three pillars that are holding their whole operation up. And it really is a simple but totally brutal formula. First, get the money to pay for everything. Second, keep a steady flow of weapons coming in. And third, desperately try to get some kind of international legitimacy to make it all seem normal. The thinking is, if you can knock down these three pillars, the whole thing starts to fall apart. Now, what's fascinating here is that the report shows that international pressure can actually work. The early sanctions, they had a real effect. They messed up supply chains, cut off cash flow. But here's the bad news. That momentum has totally stalled. As the world got distracted, the coordinated effort kind of fizzled out. And that's given the junta room to adapt and find new ways to get its hands on money and weapons. Okay, so this brings us to that third pillar, legitimacy. The junta says they're going to hold elections, but the UN report is, well, it's blunt. It calls the whole thing a dangerous sham. And I mean, how could it not be? You can't have a real election when opposition leaders are in jail, or worse, when you're not even allowed to criticize the process, and when 40 political parties have just been wiped off the map. So now, let's shift from the strategy and the politics to what this all actually means for people on the ground, because there is a massive human cost here. The report shows how the junta's actions are turning what was already a disaster into a full-blown catastrophe. This timeline right here is it's absolutely sickening. A huge earthquake hits, right? The world expects a humanitarian response. What does the junta do? They start blocking aid from reaching areas they don't control. Then, get this, they announce a humanitarian ceasefire, only to immediately ramp up airstrikes against civilians to the highest level they've been since the coup started. I mean, they literally weaponized a natural disaster? And this is what it feels like to be on the receiving end of those attacks. This is from an eyewitness, a survivor of a military paraglider attack that dropped bombs on a candlelight vigil. The situation was totally chaotic. People were shouting for help and screaming in panic. This is the brutal reality the report brings to light. With a crisis this bad, you would think there'd be this huge international response. But this is where that invisibility factor becomes so deadly. The report points to this really dangerous gap between what people desperately need on the ground and the support that's actually showing up. This chart just says it all, doesn't it? The UN's humanitarian plan for Myanmar is just shockingly underfunded. They've only received about 13% of the money they actually need. This isn't just a line on a budget sheet. It's a direct result of the world looking away, and it is a catastrophic failure. And those funding cuts, they have immediate life-or-death consequences. The World Food Program has already had to cut food rations for over 1 million people, health clinics are shutting their doors, and for Rohingya refugees, their food aid might stop completely. These are actual lifelines just being cut. But the report doesn't just leave us with the problem. It ends with a really urgent call to action, and it lays out a pretty clear roadmap for what the international community needs to do. Which really brings us back to that core question, right? If the whole thing is held up by money, weapons, and this fake legitimacy, what can actually be done to knock those pillars over? Well, the UN's recommendations are really direct. First, cut the money. Sanction the specific banks that are bankrolling the military. Second, stop the weapons. That means a real arms embargo, and that has to include the aviation fuel they use for their airstrikes. Third, deny legitimacy.
The whole world needs to call out these sham elections for what they are and refuse to recognize them. And finally, and maybe most urgently, fully fund the humanitarian aid to save people's lives.
And the report closes on this really powerful idea. This is not a problem for half measures or for divided attention. It needs an all-hands-on-deck approach, because for the people of Myanmar, the stakes, well, they really could not be any higher.